Hello and welcome to Highlights Present Data Security for Marketers. I'm Scott Taylor and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started here, just a few housekeeping notes. So our goal for today's webinar is for it to be an interactive session. So as you can see on the GoToMeeting toolbar on the right, you can submit questions. So throughout the presentation today, please submit your questions on the right there, and we'll save the last 15 minutes to answer them. Don't worry about taking notes today. We'll be following up with an email with a video of the webinar recording and the entire deck for your records. If you want to live tweet with us today, please use #highlights. And if you have any questions that we don't answer today, feel free to reach out to us at contact@heilemangroup.com. So now I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters. First, we have Chelsea Kiko. She's our marketing automation team lead here at Heilemann Group. Michelle Law, our analytics process lead at Heilemann Group. And a special guest today, Bob Ekman, the Chief Information Security Officer at MCPC. Our agenda for today, we want to talk about how you can protect your organization, how to protect your user. We'll summarize with some key takeaways. And like I said, we'll save the last 15 minutes for your questions. With that, I'll hand it over to the presenters.
So this is Bob Ekman, Chief Information Security Officer for MCPC. I first want to thank Heilemann for inviting me to join you guys today. I'm really privileged and honored to be here. I don't think there's ever a bad time to talk about data security. It's something that's very important to all of us, something that, certainly is becoming more of an issue as we begin to see regulations such as GDPR and really some more regulations from China and India and some other foreign countries relative to data privacy, but even here in the United States as well. And so I think it's important for us to kind of highlight data security and marketing, kind of focus on just the marketing piece. At MCPC, I get to work with a number of companies as a CISO as a service. And so, there's a pretty wide breadth and depth of security from a vertical perspective. Marketing specifically has a number of challenges that really come to the forefront. Marketing plays different roles relative to being, a target of malicious actors. Marketing firms have a treasure trove of data and a very open environment. A lot of social media, press releases, outreach to and different types of activities to the general public. Marketing firms and PR firms can function as an attack vector as well, or a pathway for adversaries. So think of that one-stop shop, and I think we're going to touch on some of that here today as well. And then, of course, marketing firms, you have the protector of the brand. And so when you think in terms of, what is the current climate of data security and marketing, as we've noted here, 79% of consumers would stop dealing with a company if their personal data was misused. I've seen some estimates that say upwards of 50 to 60% of companies, like to see a cybersecurity program and a demonstrated approach to keeping data secure as they are now shopping for services from different types of organizations. Post-GDPR, GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation out of the European Union that is really designed to help us give us guidance rather to how we will protect personally identifiable information for European Union citizens. So post-GDPR, 40% of companies think reliance on customer consent will be the biggest challenge. So how do we get our customers, or as GDPR regulation denotes it as the data owner, right? How do we get that individual to either give us implied or explicit consent to use their data in various ways, and how do we maintain that? And I think that has certainly been a huge challenge for marketing firms. I think we could layer on top of that, additional regulations around GDPR for right to be forgotten, and various processes that we have to protect. And I think we're going to touch on some of those here a little bit later today as well. Next slide.
The first category we're going to cover here is protecting your organization. And so throughout this, we've highlighted 3 specific areas that we would suggest starting with and focusing on it. And then within those categories, we have specific actionable suggestions that you can take to improve your data security. The first area are your platforms. So this could include, but are definitely not limited to, your website, advertising accounts, social media accounts, any type of marketing platform or software. For starters, it's always important to use strong passwords. Definitely change all default passwords so you can avoid using any built-in accounts that other people have access and knowledge to. So just simple steps that you can take to prevent breaches into your systems. A great tool to use this would be LastPass, that saves all your passwords across an organization. It also, rolling into the next bullet point here, assigns access levels so that only the necessary people have access to the necessary platforms and softwares. It dynamically contains and will set up new passwords for each individual platform and saves them so you don't have to remember each specific platform. Additionally, it also creates a great plan if you did have an employee leave, which we never like to think about, but always will happen at some point. So you're able to go ahead and maintain any access to platforms that they previously had, update the passwords in a comprehensive manner, while ensuring they no longer have the access, but your current employees are able to still maintain access to those platforms or softwares. I think it's something that we're starting to see a lot more in Google, especially with assigning access levels out, particularly if you're in the Google Analytics 360 suite. So if you're working with Google Analytics, Google AdWords, Google Optimize, or any of those specific platforms, you now have the ability through that 360 suite to assign out access levels at a high level, as well as to view those access levels at a high level, whereas before you had to individually manage and access those user admin levels for each individual profile. And I know this is something that we're starting to see rolled out to additional marketing platforms as well.
Yeah, and Michelle, like one thing I would probably like to add to that too is making sure, and Bob, you might have something to mention here too, is designating somebody to make sure that they handle all of the admin of doing this. So, here at Howman, we have, our development team, the head of development kind of manages all this stuff for us. So making sure there's one person's hands on it instead of several people or a team kind of trying to manage all of this.
Yeah, definitely, and those are both great points, Chelsea and Michelle. I would layer into that as well. When we talk about strong passwords, we have typically and historically said that it's a certain number of characters, typically more than 8 characters. It seems to be a standard. I will tell you that organizations are now going up to 15 characters, a mandatory number of characters, just because it makes it that much harder to crack. And in some cases, I had heard recently from a hack group, a white hat team locally, that it took them 72 hours to crack an 18-character password, to give you some idea. So the tools are out there to do that kind of thing. What I actually recommend is if you can avoid putting in an upper limit on the number of characters they can use, let the user use as many characters as they want and create a passphrase instead of a password that is really difficult for you to remember and typically results in lots of requests for password reset. Create a passphrase. Take a phrase out of something that that is unique to you and allow users to do that and layer in those security elements as well. Access controls by role, great idea, right? We call that in my business least privilege or separation of duty, where I don't have access to things I shouldn't have access to. And it's really it seems like common sense, but you'd be surprised. Some very flat organizations, you get in the door, technically on the network, you can see everything. We want to make sure we're limiting that. Data protection plans, so assign that data governance team, which I think we're going to talk more about data protection a little bit later. Lockout attempts is becoming a big issue. So one of the new attack vectors we're seeing is something called password spray, where hackers or adversaries will try to hit multiple sites using the same credentials that belong to that company, because they know that company's not watching for failed logon attempts across the sites. They're only watching for that one specific login. So I would suggest if your people can do correlative studies, they should. And of course, keep things patched. That's like the number one. We've seen that time and time. Just these are great suggestions, I think, that can help any organization.
Definitely. Yeah, and just to add to the last point for security updates, always important to keep your platforms up to date, because hackers are, reading those release notes from security updates and they're looking for those unpatched systems. So if you're not doing those updates, you're kind of an open target in that sense. So our core takeaway here would, one task, especially coming from a marketing point of view, would be to take the time to establish the correct hierarchy of access throughout your organization. Be that leader that's driving that team, or if you're not going to be that person that is the leader of the team, identify them and drive that initiative within your organization. The next topic we have is third-party security. So third parties can be any vendor, customer, or partner whose security failure can lead to a security failure of any of your critical assets or systems. The first priority here would be knowing your third-party platforms and identify what identify what data or information that they have access to. So without this knowledge, you are leaving yourself one step behind and not preparing yourself for any potential crisis situations. The next step would be always talk to your IT and legal teams, and especially not just the third-party teams when onboarding a new platform. It's not just a marketing decision. You need to incorporate the entire team so you're able to make a full, rounded, educated decision when you're onboarding, especially if you're able to create a repeatable process when you're bringing in new integrations or platforms. If you're able to establish that, you can save everyone's time rather than creating this new process every single time you're looking to onboard. And then, of course, this is floating on a little bit to protecting your user, but of course, always be transparent about how you're using data, both how you're using your data and your user's data is being used by those third parties. And we'll touch on privacy policies later, but that's definitely a key area to highlight that type of information. So overall, the key point here is review your third-party associations. It can seem really overwhelming and daunting at first, but just start small, start in one place. The important thing is that you're just starting and initiating that process.
So that's a great call out, Michelle, right? Third-party vendors represent probably the #1 threat vector that most organizations have. And you look at Equifax, Target, most of the big hacks that we're aware of, they started with third-party vendors, right? In one case, it was an HVAC vendor that connected to a system at a major retailer, Target, and was able to infect them through the HVAC system. So, when you talk in terms of third-party, I think it's very important. We oftentimes focus on the relationship and not on the assets and the data. And we really should be focused on the assets and the data. When you look at what we do at MCPC, just as an example, we do asset configuration for our customers. We do 200,000 plus assets a year. We represent a single point vulnerability, and our customers hold us to task for that. We have a rigorous internal security program. We call it Secured Technology Logistics for that reason. And then we monitor the asset at our new Link 59 SOC facility, a secured operations center. We're able to watch it during its lifetime to make sure it stays secure and the data stays secure. And then finally, asset disposition. You think about third parties. Where's that asset going and the data that's on it when you're done with it, right? We have secured asset disposition where we can disposition that asset accordingly and according to its assurance level. So these third-party integrations are very important. We do a number of agreements with our customers. We get questionnaires from them, pretty lengthy, asking us to detail our security program, right? I'm not saying do that for every third party, but I would say if they have access to sensitive data on your side, they should probably in some way, you should understand their cybersecurity postures. These are great call-outs.
Yeah, and I would probably just add to Bob and Michelle, you guys had good points. From a marketing standpoint, what I've noticed in different organizations where I've worked and clients I've dealt with is people get really excited to integrate with third parties. So they're like, okay, we can just purchase it, download it, integrate it, we're ready. So I don't think a lot of times people plan for the fact that, especially at bigger organizations, that you have to go through your legal teams, you have to go through your IT team. So make sure that you do as much vetting as you can on a platform and then present that to your team, and always plan ahead. So if you want to have a new webinar platform and you have a webinar next month, that's probably not going to happen. So just making sure you plan ahead on when you're going to be purchasing or having these integrations happen with your current platform.
And consult with your security teams as well.
Yeah.
Don't do it on your own.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that ties in nicely with the takeaway here. So as Chelsea said, making that sign-off process and involving multiple teams and the right people coming to the table to approve this process, but also importantly, making it a repeatable process so you're able to check in on a regular basis. And so if you do need to onboard something quickly, you're able to do that without as much of a holdup.
Now it just, because another thought came to mind, many of our regulations, especially GDPR and regulations such as that, are requiring us to have full attestation of how we are disposing of that information and that data and that asset. At our new asset disposition center I mentioned earlier, it's in Old Brooklyn, that facility is really designed to incorporate that process into a company's, at the end of life. And so having that documented approach is so important in an audit space, or if you do have a compromise of some kind, if there's a legal challenge, you have the documentation that proves that you're demonstrating industry reasonable standards.
The last topic we have for protecting your organization is SSL certificates, or secure socket layer certificates. And these ensure transactions between web servers and browsers are secure by protecting website content and data. This is critical for any e-commerce, financial, or really any site that's using credit card information or financial information. Coming soon will be any site that's collecting data, but this is all kind of the future that's evolving before us. As some of you may be aware from a marketing perspective, Chrome browsers are displaying a warning icon or a not secure warning in the address bar near the URL. There's a screenshot image example in the PowerPoint here.
Michelle, could I interject real quick?
Yeah, please do.
What that basically means is that, just in more tactical terms, there are entities called certificate authorities who actually issue those certificates for websites to function. And when they issue an SSL or an HTTPS certificate, what they're essentially saying is that is met our standard for secure, right? So what that means, though, is if you go to a site that's supposed to be HTTPS, right, secure, and it's got, as you mentioned, the red lettering with the 2 red lines through it, what that means is that site has lost its certificate for whatever reason. A lot of times it's just a matter of someone didn't renew it and they need to, but in some cases it's because it's a nefarious site. So that's a really good call out. I think it's important for especially marketers to know that.
Definitely. Yeah, good point. And that's one of the points on here is, these certificates do expire every 1 to 2 years, so it's important to be staying on top of that and tracking that. Yeah, but overall, it's important not only for your organization to keep that data safe, but it's also going to be reflective back to your customers or clients. As we said at the beginning of this presentation, if they feel like their personal data is going to be misused, they're going to lose that personal trust in your brand and your representation of your organization. So this is an easy way to, share that you're secure, as well as also at the same time protecting their user information. Additionally, from a marketing perspective, it is a known ranking factor in Google search results. It actually dates back to August of 2014. What Google specifically has found is that an HTTPS signals a higher quality site or higher quality content, so they are favoring them in the search results. So it's not one of the top ranking factors currently, but it's certainly a factor, and we do believe that that's only going to increase in importance as time goes on.
And what that basically means is anything I enter on that site is encrypted. Encrypted meaning it's spaghettified, right, before it leaves the site and put back together, if you will, when it arrives at its destination, so that someone sitting in the middle can't steal that information, right, or do what we call a man-in-the-middle attack.
Mm-hmm. So our key takeaway here would be, if you don't currently have this certificate, check with your hosting provider. Many of them will offer this certificate for free, or if not, initiate that process to make sure that your site is staying secure.
Yeah, so now this is Chelsea. They'll be taking over the rest of the conversation here with input from Bob and Michelle. So thanks, Michelle, for that. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more of a different angle on protecting your user, more from a marketing standpoint, but also just why your organization should adopt these strategies in general. So I know a lot of talk has been going around with GDPR and CAN spam and CASL, just along the lines of being compliant. But as an organization, you shouldn't just be compliant because somebody's telling you to. You should always be compliant because you want to protect your users. You want to make sure you're delivering the right type of content and emails or whatever to your users because they value it, not just because you want to spam people. So we're going to be going into a couple ideas on how to stay compliant, but also how to get your marketing ask out of it too. I've heard from a lot of conversations about GDPR that marketers are concerned that they can't market to their leads like they want to. They're concerned their database is going to be a lot smaller. So these are just kind of some ways to combat that, and hopefully your conversion rates can also, stay intact from before you implement different compliance regulations. So the first one we'll talk about is subscription centers. So subscription centers have definitely been in play for a while now. This is just where a user can go and update their email preferences and communications from an organization. So This is also a place where they can unsubscribe. But the difference between subscription centers and just kind of like a one-click unsubscribe is hopefully from a marketing perspective, you can not lose the lead. So if you have a one-click unsubscribe, somebody's easily going to click that link. They're out of your mailing list forever. You can't really get that lead back. So when it comes to subscription centers, it's important for you to try to offer different ways to communicate to your audience. So you can have the user choose, like the screenshot here on the PowerPoint, whether they want to be only receiving newsletters for certain conditions or screenings for a healthcare organization, or they only want to hear content about events coming up. Just making sure you tailor your communications to the user so you don't lose them overall as a lead, but they're also getting content that's relevant to them. And the other plus here is you can also stay compliant by offering, in every email or every communication for your user to update their preferences. So you're still giving the opportunity to unsubscribe, but you're hoping you don't lose them. Another great opportunity for the subscription center is to link to your privacy policy, which we'll actually get a touch here in another slide or two. You can link to your privacy policy within your subscription center so you can be really transparent and clear to the user how you're going to be using this information and how you're going to be communicating to your audience.
So Chelsea, can I
speak
to that? So that's another great call out, right? In security, we have a couple one concept we live by is defense in depth. And what that means basically is we put as many barriers between us and the bad guy as possible. And then we use something called defense and diversity, which is those aren't all the same barriers. We use different types of barriers because if I have all the same locks on the door, then I can pick one. I'll get the rest of them very quickly. So where this comes into play here is the assurance of the data, right? What level of importance is the data that we're capturing? If I'm capturing publicly available information, then the assurance level is what I don't want to say non-existent, but it's low, right? We're not as concerned about protecting that as we might social security numbers or salary information for individuals, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea here with subscription centers is know what data, right, you're interacting with and place the right number and allowance of controls in front of that data that's reasonable, that allows your marketing teams to do what they need to do, while at the same time keeping the security person happy and helping them keep hair on their head, which I have none for that very reason. So, but the point is know what you're collecting and know how to protect it, right? Yeah,
and the only other thing I probably would add again from a marketing perspective, more of the platform regulation. So I have a lot of clients ask me, okay, how do I manage these people? So how do they manage if they unsubscribe or their email's invalid or they only choose certain topics on the subscription center? A lot of marketing automation platforms like Marketo, HubSpot, they will manage that for you, which is nice. It's kind of like an out-of-the-box practice they do when somebody unsubscribes. They automatically update the lead record for that. But when it comes to subscription centers, it's just a little bit more of advanced technology in the platform to make sure you segment your audience appropriately to what they choose.
Yeah, I'd recommend consult with your security team. If you don't have a security team, bring someone like me in that can help you even on a part-time basis, just to understand what level of protection should you be looking for in this type of arrangement with subscription center. So it's a great idea.
Yeah. Yep. So the key takeaway here, and I kind of already mentioned it, subscription centers are just great to kind of avoid the 100% conversion rate of an unsubscribe one click. So you're hoping that instead of unsubscribing completely, they're still going to be in your database, you won't lose them, and you can still communicate relevant information to them. So kind of going along those lines, next is privacy policies. So privacy policies, you've been hearing a lot about these again because of the GDPR rollout. A lot of people went in and either created a privacy policy if they didn't have one, which probably wasn't the best, but that they didn't have one in the first place. But also they added new content to kind of tailor and be compliant with the new GDPR rollout. So privacy policies are just something that every organization should have and should have readily available to any user. So whether that's within your emails, on your forms, in your subscription centers, making sure anytime that a user can go in and click and read your privacy policy. Privacy policies, a lot of people think that it's a lot of legal jargon, but that's actually the opposite of what it should be. It should be really easy to read for an end user. They should understand what you're trying to say, what information you're collecting and why, and how long you're going to be retaining this information all within a privacy policy. A lot of times I tell different clients, people are trying to implement these to avoid legalese, just try to write it as if any user would understand it. So it's really important to communicate with users what you're doing with their data. Not only is it because it remains compliant. But with a lot of data breaches going on, and I know like Facebook's a big one that's been happening, communicating like why you're getting this data and what you're doing with it, so your user will trust you more. The more your prospects trust you, the more they're probably going to convert and have business with you. And then a link to privacy policy on all forms and subscription center, again, is really important because when somebody fills out a form, that's the number one thought in their head is, what are you doing with this? Or they won't fill out a form because they're just going to email me 3 times a day and I'm going to, get annoyed with their email. So making sure that you link it to the form because it's top of mind at the time, somebody can click in and see what you're doing with their data and why. And the last point is it just helps your organization stay compliant. Like I said, especially with GDPR rollout and others, I only see more happening. Just making sure your organization is compliant and your users, again, trust you.
And I think one point there, that the legalese issue, I've read many of these privacy statements, and some of them read like Shakespeare. I mean, it's really, not that Shakespeare is bad, it's good stuff, but I'm just saying it's just not the easiest, really, unless you're a lawyer, really understanding it, or a security person, really. So what I recommend you do there is write it from, as Chelsea mentioned, from the perspective of any user, lowest common denominator thinking there, right? But at the same time, I also recommend perhaps focus grouping it. Bring in a group of people that represent a good sample of your population. I do a lot of CISO as a service for higher education. So we've done that with, we bring in faculty, admin, students of all years, and we have them read it for us and give us their, do you understand what each one of these elements is? Why is that so important? Because we document those results, and if there's ever a challenge to the privacy policy, we have now fully tested, vetted, and documented our approach to say, wait a minute, this focus group of 15 or so people really understand what it is, so it makes it harder to challenge. The other thing I'd mention here is don't ignore GDPR in your privacy policy. Make sure you point specifically to GDPR. You should have an opt-in policy relative to GDPR. I'd even link it in there and make sure those applicable persons reading this can click that link and go to opt-in and opt-out of certain services.
And to that point of the GDPR, making sure, I'm glad you mentioned that, is a lot of people think, I don't need to mention GDPR because I don't market to EU employees or residents, but you don't know when somebody's going to fall on your page. If your web page can reach them, they can reach it as well. So making sure you're compliant, just because you might not have leads in your current database for this, but you might have leads that want to read a white paper or fill out a form that do live in the EU. So you make sure that you address the GDPR concerns.
Not to mention GDPR, I mean, that concept of data privacy, data owner versus processor versus controller is I will tell everybody right now, is going to become a lot more prevalent. We're seeing it in the new India's new cyber law. We're definitely seeing it in China's new cyber law. I think it's going to become more the mainstay. UK is heading in that direction. Canada is. I would fully expect the United States to as well. So, but either do it now or do it later. But either way, good suggestion, Chelsea.
Yeah, and I was listening, I think, to a webinar a couple weeks ago about GDPR, and everybody was saying, don't think it's not going to come to the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's going to.
Yep.
If anything, I see it happening sooner than later, just because, like I said, I mentioned Facebook, a lot of data breaches going on. They're really just going to start making sure that these are being enforced, in my opinion. So the next piece, and this is, again, this kind of became a little bit more popular of a topic because, again, of GDPR, but it's still something that I think that organizations should implement, is cookie consent. So as most marketers know, we like to be creepy, and we use people's cookies, and we track them, and we see what they do, and then we send them relevant content to where they are in the buy cycle because we stalked them in a good way. So cookie consent is huge because it's a great way for you to make sure that you're transparent to any users on your website. And I'm sure many of you have gone to any website recently, and there's the pop-up at the top of the screen that says, our use of cookies and how they use that. So some people get annoyed and exit it out, but I still think it's really important to be transparent to your users. Let them know, hey, I am tracking you. You visited my website. You must have an interest in me, and I'm just letting you know that we're taking your cookied information, and we're going to try to send you relevant content to help curb your decision. So I don't think it's a wrong thing to use cookie consent to track via cookies, but definitely make sure you're transparent and you're open with your users. So on the screen is a couple of examples of different organizations who have implemented this on their websites. So you can either accept or you can look at your options on cookie consent. At any time, I believe organizations should have the option for users to turn off the cookie tracking. If a user feels uncomfortable and doesn't want to be tracked, there should be an easy way for them to go in and opt out of that. And this has kind of been a recent rollout with GDPR. A lot of people weren't doing this before. People didn't even know that cookies were a big reason of tracking, especially end user consumers. So making sure you're transparent in your website, just building a pop-up that says that we're using your cookies and why, giving them opportunities to be able to see how you're using the information and, again, to opt out. So I think that this is going to only be, again, rolled out to even more organizations who are just marketing in the U.S.
Yeah, and so the other thing to call out on cookies are, cookies initially were put in place to allow, marketers, primarily websites, to pull and understand what history relative to that site. That is not what cookies are being used for today.
Mm-hmm.
You can pull everything up to and including a full fingerprint of that asset down from, through the web. And so you really have to be explicit about what it is you're pulling, not just, hey, we're using cookies, but in what way are you using that cookie? Are you purely just pulling, a history, or are you really pulling the IP address, MAC address, username, blah, 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 blah? Because if you are, that will be it'll put it right in the crosshairs of GDPR, because that data is considered PII, according to the European Union and others, as we've noted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So the main takeaway here is, again, just making sure you have this available on the whole page in almost every website you have available, so your users can never say that they had a problem reaching the cookie consent disclaimer. So next, along the lines of cookie and tracking, is data retention. So this has been another hot topic recently for security for marketers. And data retention is more of how long you're going to be using the data you have collected. So you have the option and you have the consent to collect their data, but now a big question is, how long do you keep that, and how long is relevant? So a big reason why people are starting to talk about data retention is because some people might have opted in the past and then eventually unsubscribed, but they still have all the data on a user. So at what point is it compliant and is it not? So data retention is another big clause within a privacy policy that companies are now starting to write. And they are trying to be transparent and open for how long they're going to keep this data. According to the European Union, it says for as long as needed. So it's really kind of vague right now. So a lot of people are starting to put some timestamps on that. So organizations are getting together and they're like, okay, how long should we keep these people's data and different stuff we've collected on them, and what is compliant and fair to them? So a lot of organizations are starting to develop different processes behind this. Our suggestion here is take a look. It depends on your business model. It depends on what data you're collecting, what type, and some data you can retain for longer than others. So really getting together with your marketing, IT, and legal team to develop a process internally of how long you should retain this data. And again, like anything else with compliance, just be transparent in your clause of your privacy policy. Make sure you tell users how long you're going to be using their data and why. Just so they don't have to question it. And then at any time, you should give them the option to want to download or receive all the information that a company has on you as a lead. So the big thing with GDPR is I should be able to go to any company if I'm in the EU and say, hey, can you hand me all the information you have on me? And I'm going to tell you what you can keep and what you can't. So a lot of companies are starting to develop processes behind delivering that.
One of the biggest challenges I've seen at my customers, and it's been specifically with the marketing arms, what I'll call the customer-facing arm, sales, marketing, customer outreach in general. One of the biggest challenges they have is that right to be forgotten requirement that's in GDPR. I mean, people have the right as a data owner to say, you forget my data after a year, or we have to tell you how long we're going to keep it before we forget it. And what's interesting now, what I'm seeing is, what does forget mean? Forget could mean delete it. But does that mean delete it forever? That means no one can ever get to it again, right? Or does forget mean I can just change it in a way that it's no longer your data, but it's still data that we can use for marketing purposes? So de-identification, perturbation of the name, or any other identifier associated with you, but the activities that we're trying to track relative to marketing, perhaps we can keep that data somewhere. I think it's really important to consult with a security professional and legal, by the way, when you're coming up with this approach to determine, okay, if we're going to allow what we call RTBF, right to be forgotten, to happen, how do we do that in a way that really works for the data owner, but also works for our company as well? And if the answer is there's no way to differentiate the data, you can't segregate it in a way that maybe the right answer is you just delete it forever and just get rid of it. Although we don't like to do that, but we may have to. So it's a great call out.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of companies kind of doing what you just mentioned, whether it's data retention or other aspects. If they don't feel comfortable and there's kind of a gray line of if they should keep the data or not, they're just purging it out.
Yep.
because at this point you'd rather be compliant than have the possibility of winning some business.
But let me add to that if I could. Now we're moving into a cloud world, right? Everything is getting cloudified.
Yeah.
Not to use a George W. to cloudified, right? But it's becoming more cloud every day. And what does that mean, though? I delete something in my cloud. Where does it go? Is it really deleted, or is it sitting on a backup server at the data center, wherever that's sitting, right? So one thing I do recommend is anything you work with that's not on-prem, that you do not have physical control over, encrypt it wherever it sits. So if it's sitting up in the cloud, encrypt it there, because one method and proven and tried and true method of deletion in the cloud is to simply destroy the key. If you destroy the key, you have a very high certainty that no one's going to get to that data that's sitting up in the cloud, and that is in effect purging that data to a degree. So that's one recommendation. Another one is if you have it on-premise, truly do delete it, and then make sure you DDoS that system, that it cannot be recovered in any way. And keep in mind, solid state drives have to be DDoSed according to NIST standards down to, I think it's 5 millimeters. Every 5 millimeters they have to be shredded. So it's an interesting thing. But anyway, so keep in mind, data destruction means many things. That's where MCPC can really help in this space. We do quite a bit of that for our customers. As I mentioned, we're standing up a 180,000 square foot facility that's going to focus on asset and data destruction for this very purpose, to help companies not only ensure that we're doing this properly, but that we have full attestation behind it as well.
Yeah, and I've noticed some big organizations, like the platforms we use here on our marketing team, they're starting to send out kind of disclaimers to customers of, we're only going to retain data for this long, even within a platform.
That's right.
So I know Marketo just rolled this out, and marketers were freaking out, but I understand why. They used to archive and keep certain activities that a lead does for, I think, like a certain number of months, and now they're deleting it after 120 days.
But think of this use case where you've downloaded data to your asset, right? You're done with your asset. It's sitting in a drawer. You're going to get rid of it. You're going to hand it off. That asset could end up in a landfill where someone can grab it, or it could end up on eBay. And we've seen that happen before. So you really have to be careful. Those third-party agreements are so very important. Make sure you're hiring a company to take care of your assets from life to death, from birth to death, rather, that has those security measures in mind.
Yeah, agreed. So next we'll talk a little bit about, all these are kind of big topics, implied versus explicit consent. So with the rollout of, again, GDPR and CAN, SPAM, and CASL and all of the regulations, people are wondering, okay, at what point is a user giving me their information in order to market to them? So that's kind of where implied versus implicit consent come to play. So implied consent, first the difference, a lot of people don't know. So the difference between the two is implied consent means a previous business relationship exists. So not that you met somebody at a conference 4 years ago and you want to email them a certain offer. It's more of, okay, this is a prospect I talk to all the time, even though they're not a customer yet. I get lunch with him every month. We're friends, we're business partners, we like to network. Just knowing that if they received an email from you or your company, there was nothing they would say that they would feel was inappropriate. So they feel, since they know you, they know the company, that they can receive emails from you guys. A lot of times, another big thing that people are bringing up, and there's both sides of the spectrum, is business cards. So at trade shows, when somebody gives you a business card to enter a giveaway, is that complied consent? And you're going to hear answers of all types. But myself as a marketer, I would say that's not implied consent, because they're not handing you a business card saying, hey, I want to receive your newsletter every Tuesday and Thursday. They're mostly saying, hey, I want to win whatever gimmick you're giving me at this conference, so here's my business card. Other sides, people will say that is implied because they give out their information. But at what point is it clear of what they're giving their information out for? So that's where explicit consent comes into play. So that means that data and information has been freely given. So freely given meaning they filled out a form, they registered for a webinar, they came to an event and registered. They gave you their first name, their last name, their email address, all the form fields, because they want something in return. So they're downloading a white paper, they know they're giving you their information. So you can safely say, this lead gave me explicit consent to be able to mail them. So why it's important is, again, this is another legal requirement, but it's important to understand the difference between the two. If you're emailing somebody without them giving you their consent, that could raise a lot of flags for your organization. And again, could probably be a breach of some sort. But another big thing is list buying is a really big tactic in the marketing world, and this is the reason why we touched it on this webinar today, is a lot of people think list buying is a great way to get leads, which it can be, depending on who you're getting your list from. But always remember that list buying doesn't necessarily mean that those people on the list explicitly consented to receiving your communication. So you really have to kind of draw the line on who are we going to buy our list from, make sure you vet the company that you do buy it from. And then a lot of times what I do is for my clients is once we get the list, kind of running it through, like checking out the list, kind of auditing the list to make sure that there's nothing, any big red flags on why we couldn't email these people. So just knowing that you can still buy lists. It's not always the recommended, but just skip the headache and try to use your own data if you can, or lead generation. So that's a big thing we want to touch on. And another thing is website cookie opt-in. A lot of people think, again, that if they opt into visiting their website, that's also opting in to receiving your emails. Make sure that you kind of draw the line between those two as well. And then the last thing is pre-filled forms. So if they fill out a white paper 3 years ago for your company and they come back to a website and their form is pre-filled, that's not necessarily explicit consent, because it's pre-filled. They could just select submit, but making sure they freely give you their information without the pre-filled form is another important thing to note. Do you have anything to add? Or?
I was just going to say, when I first started in security, I had an old timer tell me once. He said, if you don't document it, it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, right? And this is back in the day before we had all the technology we have today. Dating myself a little bit there, but we kept manual logs of everything. Today we have great customer relationship management systems that really, anytime we touch the customer, we should be documenting that interaction, right? As a result of that, we really should be identifying those implied consent opportunities, and at least document. I met with Joe for Beats today. We had lunch and talked to him about the newsletter. He still wants to receive it. Just a little note like that. Believe me, down the road, if there's ever a challenge, being able to go back and demonstrate that you did get, implied consent during those meetings is really important. Of course, explicit consent should absolutely be documented and auditable by your organization, and ensuring that your auditors check that it's being done on a periodic basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I would agree. Just and obviously, like, the other thing is making sure everybody's on the same side with that too, like within your organization. So make sure you guys either host some kind of meetings or trainings so your sales team understands that one sales member doesn't think that implied consent means something different than another sales member. So just knowing that everybody's on the same page within the organization.
Chelsea, would you recommend that from an implied consent perspective versus explicit consent, and Amber, Michelle, that we look at that from a data perspective? Like the relative importance of the data should determine which style of consent we should pursue?
Yeah, I think it's also a great way, again, like I always say, each lead is its own lead. Treat them by one per one basis, and kind of auditing your database to see exactly what you just said. Yeah.
If I'm going after a social number, that's a little different than going after an email address for a newsletter, right?
Yeah. Okay, and a lot of times, and I feel like also users will freely give that as well. So if you have a form that's starting to ask a little bit too much, you're going to see your conversion rates are probably going to be lower. Not only because the form is longer, but if I'm trying to download a white paper and you ask me for my social security, it's a little weird.
Why? Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to download the form. So another thing is just kind of taking a look at your data and your conversion rates of your current forms and wondering, okay, is it the content that's low conversion rate, or is it because some things we're asking on the forms is limiting you a little too much? So the next point with implied versus explicit consent is for global audiences. So a lot of times, I know most organizations do market globally. So a lot of times within different countries, they don't have certain regulations or what you should do. So I always just say the best practice is explicit consent and double opt-in approach. So I know that Canada has a double opt-in approach, but this is essentially saying that if somebody freely gives you their information and they agreed, again, that they gave you their information, that you can consider that legal and you can freely communicate to them. So an example, this would be, I'm from Germany and I download a white paper. I freely give my information on the form. And then once I submit the form, you guys send me a confirmation email that says, please click this link to confirm your email address. I see this a lot just as a consumer of different organizations. Once you click that link, you verify, yes, I filled out the form, I gave you my email address, you can feel free to email me. So I think that's the best approach whenever you're marketing to a global audience. So then the last thing is just remember that implied consent does have a gray area. We kind of touched this in our earlier conversation, but just make sure that you do play it on the safe side. Again, back to what we talked about, you'd rather probably purge the records than be at any kind of risk for any kind of breach. The last key takeaway for this is just don't forget that a person has the right at any time to withdraw consent. So in making sure that you freely give them the opportunity to withdraw consent of them giving you their information or signing up for a newsletter or something.
Lastly, here we have our key takeaways from the presentation. So this is a largely recap of some of the main points we have discussed earlier. So the quick summary, our first key takeaway here is to take the time to establish the correct hierarchy of access throughout your organization, as well as your platforms and softwares. So be that leader within your organization, whether it's you heading up that team or you assigning and finding the right person to fill that role and build out that team, so that you're providing the right access to the right people.
I would add to that, if I could, monitor that access. You know, we put locks on our doors and our windows at home, but what good are those if you don't check them every night before you go to bed or whatever, right? So if you're not using them, then they're not effective. So I would recommend not just putting in place that security schema for all your different platforms in your software, but something that MCPC offers. We offer Secured Operations Center. We do monitoring for our customers. We monitor their endpoints, laptops, desktops, tablets. We're able to tell you if there's been a compromise or an IT health issue. That is so important to our customers to really understand what's happening in their environment. So I strongly recommend that organizations either do it internally or go to a third party to have that type of monitoring being done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Additionally, that rolls in nicely is creating that repeatable process, as well as regular check-ins on any third parties that have access to any of your data or information. So involving the right people and bringing the right people to the table, and perhaps even consulting an external security team to make sure it's not just from a marketing perspective and you can get that full 360 point of view. Also looking into the SSL certificate, check with your hosting provider, start that conversation earlier. It's only going to become more important with time. So the sooner you can get it on the site, the more beneficial and ahead of the game you can get.
Yeah, and then from my perspective, I can cover the rest of the key takeaways. So when it comes to protecting the users, just making sure, other than just offering an unsubscribe, that you give the user options to update the preferences, so you don't risk a total unsubscribe and losing them from your database. Avoid legalese. Again, in the privacy policy, make sure you write it so a normal human can read it, and that it makes sense to them when it comes to being a user. Making sure that you have your privacy policy and any kind of data retention or cookie consent freely available on your website, so people can see that there's a call out and they actually accept that they're being tracked via cookie. And the last is just making sure that, again, that the person at any time has the right to withdraw consent or ask for data that you have collected on them, just making sure that you're compliant with that if any of those requests would arise. And I think with that, unless you guys have anything to add, that mostly completes the presentation. I know we might have some questions, Scott, so if we want to pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea, Michelle, and Bob. It looks like we had a handful of questions come through, so I'll go ahead and ask them, and then feel free to chime in. So it looks like the first here, do you see the trend in marketing is to start more career roles where people own the security side just specifically for marketing?
You might be able to speak to this as well, but I would say yes. I could see, I even saw some articles where people are starting to appoint or hire like a data compliance officer for a marketing team. So I only see that trend rising as we see these compliant regulations moving across, globally.
So one thing I'll say is the regulatory aspect will drive it. GDPR requires, if you have European Union citizen data, you have control of it or you process it, requires that you have a data protection officer role. So that is typically a lawyer in most organizations. Some organizations it is a security person, but usually even if it's a lawyer, it's someone who specializes in security or cybersecurity. But I would say yes. When I talk about security, I talk about little s security and big S security. Little s security is our internal cybersecurity program. It's the stuff we do inside the company to make sure we're secure, all the policies, procedures, training, blah, blah, blah. And then big S security is going out to customers and helping them to understand the impact of security and what we're doing to protect them. And actually identify new products. I do quite a bit of that with some of my customer-facing companies I work with in that vertical, is I help them develop security products and services for their company to outreach to their customers as well. So I absolutely see a place in a marketing firm for that kind of CISO, chief data officer role that can not only help you internally with the little s stuff, build the program and run the program, but also going out to your customers. I think that'd be a brilliant opportunity, actually.
So what advice would you give to someone, I guess, from a smaller organization that doesn't have access to legal or IT?
Rent a Bob. basically. Find that security, help, third party. Many people that do what I do, and there's quite a bit of them in the city of Cleveland and elsewhere, who provide this service on a part-time, CISO as a service engagement. We do that at MCPC. We have a number of CISOs available that specialize in different verticals. We have a healthcare vertical, finance vertical, and then I do higher ed and just about everything else. So, so I would recommend find that security partner and really drive a good relationship with that partner and get that help on a monthly basis.
And I even think from the marketing side, I think hiring third party is great, but also having one person in your team kind of champion the effort as well. So hiring or, investing in some training for an employee to start to understand these compliance regulations a little bit more, so they can kind of be that champion on the team to work with somebody like MCPC in order to make sure that their organizations are compliant.
That's a great call out. I actually require that when I
do you?
Yeah,
okay.
When I go into a mid-sized organization that really doesn't have security, mid to small, I actually require that somebody on site act as that security liaison and get CISSP training or CISA training or something relative to security so that we can start building. I'm a big proponent of, I don't want to bring fish in a basket so everybody can eat. I'd rather not just teach you to fish. I want to teach you how to make the pole so you can go fish on your own and teach others to fish. So that's the goal, and that should be the goal of any good third-party security provider.
Great, thank you. So we talked a little bit about implied consent today. So this next question is, how long do you wait until an implied consent is no longer valid?
That's a good question. Again, it's something that's a little bit vague, but I also think that you should deal with on a case-by-case basis. So in my mind, you kind of use your common sense. If you used to have lunch with somebody every month and they were a prospect and they were like, listen, now's not the time, we're going to go with somebody else, and it's been a year, I would not consider them an established business relationship. You no longer really talk to that person, so I don't think that they would imply that they were giving consent to you. Another thing is within your organization, draw a line, so make sure everybody's on the same page. So if we talk to this person or they gave us implied consent and it's been 90 days, or it's been a year, or it's been a year and a half, let's just mark them as we no longer feel comfortable that we have their implied consent. So I really think you need to take a look at it from your business perspective, but also a case-by-case basis.
I would also recommend that you should really have a data policy internally to the organization that really defines, many customers I work with, we call it a data governance team that kind of reviews data and determines, okay, for this type of data, we're going to require this requirement for both implied and explicit consent, right? But for specialized data, it might be a much more strict requirement. That data policy should really be driven by that data governance team that's helping to define that. And that should really, lead into a data classification standard, right? That says, here's the different levels of data we deal with, and here's how we as an organization have committed to protect those levels of data. And in that should be that implied and explicit consent requirement, as well as your opt-in, opt-out requirements to meet GDPR and so forth.
Great. Our next question here is regarding SSL certificates. So, Michelle, I guess, how do you justify the cost of an SSL certificate to your executives?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember here is that it's only going to become more valuable and more important. And really, it's hard to put a dollar sign or a cost signifying your customer or client's trust. So anything that you can do to prevent that from being broken, you can only see as a good investment from that point of view.
So we talked about a lot today. So where do we begin? As an organization, how do you start with all of these things that we were discussing today?
Jump on
that.
I
know that process.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, I would say definitely know your data. Start there. What do you have in your organization? Implement that data governance model that demonstrates access control at the various levels of data that you have. Know where your data resides. We have, as part of that monitoring process I mentioned to you, a tool that can search endpoints and tell you where you have PCI, PHI. PCI is payment card information, protected health information, personally identifiable information sitting on endpoints. We actually had a customer in an incident response ask us to do that for them, and we did it. And we inadvertently found sitting on an accounts payable, it was a payroll machine, all the W-2s for that organization in a PDF file, okay, sitting in the trash can. So to give you some idea of how dangerous that could be, you can perturbate, delete, shred the key, get rid of, right to be forgotten, all that data on your servers, and yet you have it sitting on a very insecure, laptop. In fact, our tool was also able to determine that that same laptop had iTunes running, never been patched, had Java, never been patched. Operating system was 3 updates late. So to give you some idea of how important that is. So I say know where your sensitive data is, control access to it, and then finally, know where your data is going. Who you're interacting with. Make sure you have those right vendor management programs. You should have a good matrix that vendors have to fill out in order to get data from you. Asset disposition, we talked quite a bit about that. When you get rid of this laptop, who has access to that data at that point? Know who's interacting with it and how they're doing it. We have a great process around that, and we attest to that process. I'll also say train your people. Awareness is the #1 defense we have. It's the best tool in the CISO's tool belt. Train them by role. Don't just give everybody the same training. We mentioned earlier, maybe there's that liaison security role within a marketing department. Get that person specialized, get them CISSP certified, which is a cybersecurity certification, or something like that. And then communicate regularly. This is marketing. We should be great at it, right? Do that daily or weekly or monthly newsletter. Do a stand-up at every staff meeting you have where you talk about security and concerns. And I'll say this, open your security program with a period of amnesty for people to come to you and tell you about some of the security problems they have without, any risk of being, flogged in the square later. But then at some point, put your program in place and make sure you're monitoring it appropriately. And then finally, I always stress when I talk, be resilient and be ready. It's not if, but when. I'll tell you, there's 2 types of CISOs in the world, those that have been breached and pretty much everybody else, right? If I know I've been breached, I know I've been breached, but then there's those that think they haven't been breached. And I'll tell you right now, everybody has been touched in one way or another by compromise. Everybody in this room probably has, no doubt, everybody on this call. So Equifax probably took care of that for most of us. So incident response is another huge aspect. So I call this, when you get punched, how do you punch back, right? Incident response helps us do that. Ensure you have disaster recovery, business continuity. You have those emergency communication plans, so important for marketing teams especially because you have to communicate so quickly. GDPR requires us within 72 hours to notify the data owner of a potential breach. And I will tell you that most breaches, we're still working through the machinations of the actual breach over a 72-hour period. Very rarely do they get resolved in just a day or two. Normally we can close the gap, remediate the issue, and then we go back and do a forensic investigation and a post-mortem report that really identifies what really happened. That takes a long time to come up with that. So they want it in 72 hours. So be ready to produce that documentation in 72 hours.
Great. Well, Bob, thanks for coming in and joining us today. Chelsea, Michelle, thank you for the insights. As I mentioned previously, we'll be sending out a video recording of today's webinar along with the slides as a slide share. So look for that email. And again, thanks for joining us. Happy marketing.